Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, hey guys. So, Bastille Day is tomorrow in France, and I'd like a bit of a refresher on the history of it. So that's what we're going to do right now. I did a preemptive like, subscribe. This is Paris, Paris, French history, history of Bastille Day. Let's do it. I see the Bastille as kind of like the Tower of London in England, but maybe that's not a great comparison.
For the longest time, the Bastille trapped the people of Paris under its terrorizing shadow. It stood there, tall, in the middle of the city as an eternal reminder of royal despotism, a site of endless tortures, oppression, and fear. Yet, when it was finally stormed on July 14th, 1789, the people were unable to find the torture chambers and rotting corpses that the rumors led them to believe existed. And of the few prisoners they found, none of them were as frail and miserable as writers such as Voltaire had once described them. So how did the destruction of a mostly abandoned old fortress that treated its few prisoners well become a symbol of the French Revolution?
Interesting.
In the 14th century, France was in the middle of the 100 Years' War, and the capital was threatened by the rotten scoundrels commonly known as the English. The west of Paris was already protected by the Louvre. Yes, this Louvre. However, it was much less glamorous back then. But Paris's expansion meant that the east needed protection too. This was especially true after the capture of the French king following the disastrous Battle of Poitiers. As a result, the mayor of Paris, then known as a provost, undertook the strengthening of the city's defenses by expanding its walls in 1357 and building two large towers around the Saint-Antoine Gate. These types of defenses were known as
Looks like a sort of dike here as another line of defense.
towers around the Saint-Antoine Gate. These types of defenses were known as bastilles, and so the gateway was named the Bastille Saint-Antoine. Following this, per French tradition, the mayor was executed in 1358.
Per French tradition.
A decade later, the King of France was still concerned by English attacks and ordered the new provost of Paris, Hugues Aubriot, to fortify the Bastille Saint-Antoine. He did so by building 6 new towers, thus giving the Bastille its iconic shape. At 68 meters tall, the fortress stood far above everything surrounding it, which was mostly just countryside. And
Interesting. So that's a giant thing I just learned that I didn't know before that, is that it... Bless me. Excuse me. Sorry. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. I didn't know that it was originally just 2 towers at a gate to the outside of the city and then built upon to become the prison. I did not know that. That's a big thing.
a few hamlets. Its design was highly innovative for its time, as its round shape made it stronger than square counterparts, and its regular height allowed for faster troop movements. In recognition of this architectural marvel, per French traditions, Aubriot was made the very first prisoner of the Bastille. What an honor. Yet, this was all in vain, as in 1420, the King of England was able to capture Paris. The fact that the Bastille was usually garrisoned by 20 people might have had something to do with it. 16 years later, the French recaptured.
Look at this guy just like holding a hand cannon, just so nonchalantly. I really wonder how people back in the day, I'm not sure how old this painting is, if it was done by people of the time of these attacks or centuries later on. But I always think about before cameras, when you're trying to depict an historical event or like show what you saw, how would you kind of show the faces and what people are doing if you can't remember exactly every single expression on everyone's face and how you would try to be as accurately as accurate as you possibly could.
Might have had something to do with it. 16 years later, the French recaptured Paris, but just as they were getting over the humiliation of losing their capital, the Burgundians successfully captured the fortress and the city in 1464. Throughout the 16th century, the Bastille was further developed, along with the city of Paris, which would reach a population of 250,000 by the end of the century. Through the addition of an arsenal and arms depot, it became a prominent military center, and as such, it was at the center of numerous conflicts during France's brutal religious wars and subsequent civil wars. In the 17th century, with the reign of Louis XIV, the Bastille gained its notoriety as the symbol of French despotism and absolutism. As Louis XIV further strengthened and centralized power into its own hands, it would detain over 2,000 individuals throughout his reign, or an average of 43 yearly. A stark contrast to the 7 prisoners that remained in the Bastille when it was stormed in 1789. What made the Bastille so unique, so oppressive, was the fact that all its prisoners were put there only by order of lettres de cachet. A lettre de cachet were direct orders from the king, which were generally used to imprison someone without trial for an indefinite amount of time.
Okay, that's an important point, because so no prisoners were in the Bastille for ordinary, like, civil crimes and through more less kingly justice mechanisms. It was all just, these are people put there by the king, and that would give it a sort of aura of oppression that it might not have if it was for more ordinary, maybe more justly sent people to the Bastille.
Even worse so, Louis XIV is known to have used them for reasons as petty as disagreeing with him on religious matters. The man in the Iron Mask, whose identity is still unknown today,
there's a movie on this. This is a real character?
The man in the Iron Mask, whose identity is still unknown today, is probably the greatest symbol of this period, having spent more than 30 years in prison, while forced to wear a leather mask as to hide his identity.
Which probably means he was someone that, if he was recognized, people might have an issue with it.
By Louis XIV's death, Paris's population reached 400,000, and the city had started to grow around the Bastille, which now overshadowed the neighborhood. And while France's absolutist zeal faltered along with the king's death, political uncertainty and growing tension against Protestants meant that the yearly number of prisoners spiked to over 180. As Paris grew, the Bastille became a clear divide between the wealthy aristocratic neighborhood of the Marais and the densely populated working-class faubourg of Saint-Antoine. As such, it became a symbol of the growing inequalities between the nobles and commoners.
It's basically like a giant middle finger in the direction of an already upsetting, separation of classes. Then you have this giant building where people are sent often unjustifiably.
It became a symbol of the growing inequalities between the nobles and commoners. And the people started to feel true resentment against this symbol of oppression that was visible from anywhere in the neighborhood. This was aided by the numerous accounts of famous writers who stayed there, such as Voltaire or journalist Simon Nicolas Languet, who wrote dramatized accounts of their stay at the Bastille. Ironically, as the Bastille was being used less and less while living conditions improved, its image and reputation became further and further tarnished. By Louis XV's reign, the Bastille yearly prisoner count barely passed 20, and those who were in prison were treated relatively well. Even critics recount the wonderful dinners they enjoyed, often with the governor of the Bastille himself. And life wasn't so bad for the common man, given that the prison spent twice as much as a laborer's salary on their care. The once feared dungeons of the prison were no longer in use, while the rooms were spacious and offered numerous amenities, including external luxuries. For example, the Marquis of Sade, whom we recently discussed, arrived with an elaborate wardrobe and over 130 books. Some even were allowed to bring their pets, while others had their servants imprisoned with them as to continue getting pandered. If this wasn't enough, the king would then offer prisoners a yearly pension following their release as to encourage good behavior. It is no surprise that Jacques Necker recommended closing the Bastille on an economics basis alone. So no, the Bastille wasn't the tower of despotism and oppression that the people believed it to be, but the secrecy, rumors, and literature that surrounded it made it a prominent symbol of it. That, combined with the fact that it had recently received 250 barrels of gunpowder, made it the perfect target for the revolutionary zeal of Parisians. On July 11, 1789, Louis XVI dismissed and banished his finance minister, the Swiss banker Jacques Necker. This caused outrage among the Parisians, who strongly favored Necker due to his support of the Third Estate and the belief that only he could save France from economic collapse. Furthermore,
is he the same guy who said you should close it based on economic purposes? One sec, guys. Sorry. Yeah, right here. So I'm at 725. Jacques Necker.
Furthermore, his dismissal was seen as a shift towards a more conservative government, and that, coupled with an increased concentration of royalist troops in the capital, led to massive protests by the locals. Over 10,000 Parisians and that, coupled with an increased concentration of royalist troops in the capital, led to massive protests by the locals. Over 10,000 Parisians garnered around the Palais Royal, where Camille Desmoulins, standing on a table with a pistol in hand, famously rallied the mob by screaming, "Citizens, there is no time to lose. The dismissal of Necker is the knell of a Saint Bartholomew for patriots." This very night, all the Swiss and German battalions would leave the Champ de Mars to massacre us all. One resource is left: to take arms. The Swiss and Germans mentioned were the foreign mercenary troops that made up half of the royalist army in the capital, and that were believed to be less sympathetic to the popular cause as a...
What kind of message does that send? That it seems like if you're a commoner and a citizen in France, where a lot of the troops that guard the monarchy are actually from the armies of other monarchies around Europe, it seems like the king and kings around Europe care more about preserving themselves than looking after their own people. You know what I mean? So that symbolism in and of itself is kind of suspicious, I guess.
And that were believed to be less sympathetic to the popular cause as opposed to the French troops that had often defected to them. This fear proved itself to be somewhat accurate as the Royal German Dragoons charged into the protesting crowd to disperse it. On July 13th, mass looting ensued as the Persians sacked any place that could include weapons, food, and supplies. The royal troops did nothing to stop the ransacking as it became clearer and clearer that they had lost control of the city. On that same day, a bourgeois militia of 48,000 men was formed to restore order. General Lafayette was then...
Imagine today you live in France and you have a bunch of German or English or Spanish soldiers that are commanded by your king to protect him. And it's like, what side are you on? What are you doing? Like, the only reason why you would do this is to protect you against us. It is why you would have soldiers from these different nations, which would be insane.
Militia of 48,000 men was for the city. On that same day, a bourgeois militia of 48,000 men was formed to restore order. General Lafayette was then given control of the militia, which he would rename the National Guard. On the following morning, the famous July 14th, the newly created militia stormed the Hôtel des Invalides, a vast military complex that held up to 32,000 muskets. However, they had no gunpowder, as the commander of the Invalides had transferred it to the Bastille, which was now the last remaining royalist stronghold in Paris. By late morning, a crowd of 954 Parisians, later called Les Vainqueurs de la Bastille, gathered around the Bastille prison. The crowd demanded its surrender, along with its supply of arms and gunpowder. Bernard René de Launay, a minor officer who commanded the Bastille, invited two representatives to start negotiations. However, the negotiations dragged on, and the impatient crowd stormed the outer courtyard and released the drawbridge, which fell on the vainqueur and killed him. Gunfire from the Bastille suddenly started, and the vainqueur feared that he had fallen into a trap. The crowd now became a senseless mob. By mid-afternoon, mutinous French troops had joined the mob, along with two cannons. These weren't powerful enough to destroy the Bastille's walls, and so they were aimed at its gates. Delaunay feared that if the crowd entered the inner courtyard, he would have to aim his cannons at them and commit a massacre. Instead, he decided to declare a ceasefire by 5 p.m. And a half hour later, he opened the doors of the Bastille to allow the vainqueur to deliver it. By the end, 98 vainqueurs had been killed, as opposed to only one defendant. In one of the very first acts of violence of the revolution, Delaunay was brutally dragged to the town hall as he begged to be killed already. As the revolutionaries argued his fate, he kicked a pastry chef in the groin, which resulted in him getting stabbed multiple times to death. His head was then cut off and put onto a spike along with the heads of 3 other officers of the Bastille. An English traveler who witnessed the scene described it as a chilling and horrid sight. Following the storming of the Bastille, the more despotic and evil it was described, the more justified the revolution.
This is why I often say that when I try to learn about history, I try to remove morality from my brain, because that's not going to help me in learning in a scientific way. I kind of try and look at history and horrible events like this, where it's like, all right, you're cutting off heads of people and massacring people, but they're fighting against a tyrannical government that would do the same to them. And so trying to do that when I'm just trying to learn is senseless. And so I just kind of see, like, this is what has happened in the past. It is terrifying how people can act under these circumstances. But if I'm going to learn about it and have any fruitful, then I look at it as like, this is how people act and how they acted when they're in these circumstances. And it's not that I have no words of like good or no or bad or yes or whatever. It's just, I'm viewing it as I would some sort of experiment. You know what I mean? That sounds, I'm sure, to a lot of people moralless or something, but that's my whole point, is that when I look at history, if you bring in morality in your head while looking at history, I'm not trying to give any lessons to people of how we should act. It's just I need to look at things. And it's when I'm seeing terrifying scenes like this is when I really have to like tell myself that, you know?
Revolution became. And so sick and evil it was described, the more justified the revolution became. And so that's what the revolutionary press did. All pieces of armor and printing presses became gruesome torture devices, while the buried remains of 15th century soldiers became prisoners that had been left to rot in the dungeons for decades. This was all propaganda and lies, but the truth is, it didn't matter. The storming of the Bastille succeeded in its main goal, legitimizing the revolution. Louis XVI learned about the event the following day and asked if it was a revolt, to which he was replied, "No, sire, it's not a revolt, it's a revolution." Following this, the king announced he would recall Necker and return to Paris from Versailles. There, he was given a tricolor cockade by the new mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and entered the town hall, surprisingly under the praises of the people who screamed, "Long live the king!" At first, the revolutionaries were unsure of the fate of the Bastille, but Mirabeau symbolically started destroying the prison himself, and at that point, he didn't leave much choice to anyone else. By November of the same year, the fortress had been destroyed, and in 1793, a fountain was built on the new Place de la Bastille. However, Napoleon disliked the revolutionary image associated with the Place de la Bastille, and decided to erect a large imperial elephant there, which would later become a prominent location of Victor Hugo's famous Les Misérables. Despite this, the ancient location of the Bastille remained a strong symbol of the revolution, and so in 1833, the July column was built there as to commemorate the 3 glorious days. The location of the Bastille, famous Les Misérables. Despite this, the ancient location of the Bastille remained a strong symbol of the revolution, and so in 1833, the July column was built there as to commemorate the three glorious days. The first official celebration of Bastille Day occurred in 1790 on the Champ de Mars and was called the Fête de la Fédération. Despite the rain, over 260,000 Parisians, or over a third of the population then, watched as General Lafayette and the King took oath on the new constitution. This was then followed by 4 days of celebrations and feasting, burning replicas of the Bastille, and, much like a kid who has recently joined college, running nudes in the streets of Paris as to celebrate newfound freedom. It was under Napoleon I that Bastille Day became more militarized as to favor national unity in the face of numerous foreign threats. During the 1870s, near the end of Napoleon III's reign, Bastille Day became a rally point for Republicans as its celebrations had been made illegal by the Emperor. Finally, with the permanent re-establishment of the Republic, it became a national holiday on 1880 and has remained the most important holiday in France ever since. Since the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, the military parade now takes place on the Champs-Élysées with the participation of our allies. And even during Nazi occupation in World War II, Bastille Day was still celebrated under the command of de Gaulle in London. But compared to July 4th in the US, it isn't really celebrated that much. Sure, there are fireworks and the parade in Paris that we all watch, but we don't really do any flag waving, and above all, no barbecue. Or maybe my family was just sad like that. Nevertheless, my friends, I hope you have a great Bastille Day, French or not. Well, this was Beres. I will see you soon. But until then, my friends, merde.
Mailed. That was good. Yeah, I was a little confused around Napoleon III here.
Republicans. Near the end of Napoleon III's reign, Bastille Day became a rally point for Republicans as its celebrations had been made illegal by the Emperor.
I wonder why it was made illegal. So was he trying to gain more power again and saw it as a means to stop him from doing that? Great video. Happy almost Bastille Day to all of you French and everyone. It is the 13th today, so probably gonna post this today, and maybe I'll do something else tomorrow and watch some of the celebrations and react to them. So love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below, answering any questions I had. You're always great with that. If I said anything you disagree with or is just straight wrong, call me out. Would love nothing more. And I hope I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.